Thanks for listening to the Red Treehouse, where I tell you scary stories to keep you up at night. You can listen to the Red Treehouse wherever you stream podcasts. Just be sure to follow, like, and subscribe. Oh, and leave a 5-star review. The Red Treehouse is dedicated to my dad. I love you, Pop. So over the past few weeks, I've been reflecting on the influences that have made me fall in love with scary stuff. Movies, books, stories, all of it. And while the biggest influence in my life was my dad, there's a secondary influence that has affected me deeply, maybe more than others. It's an old Reader's Digest book entitled Into the Unknown, and it explores a wide range of strange and supernatural phenomena: ghosts, demons, ESP, faith healing, UFOs, and more. In fact, if you can name it, it's likely in there. Anyway, while flipping through the book, I started thinking about how communities in previous centuries thought about the supernatural. So I took a deep dive and started researching and reading, and I'm pretty sure I struck gold. Literal tomes written about demonic possession, ghosts, poltergeists, haunted houses, strange forces, and more. There's one book though, True Ghost Stories, written by Herwood Carrington and published in 1915, that was the most enjoyable and fascinating. Written as a series of short true ghost stories, Carrington gives us an eerie and genuinely creepy look at the paranormal. In this episode of the Red Treehouse, I'm going to share a handful of true ghost stories taken from selected chapters in Herwood Carrington's book. Are ghosts real? And if so, can they communicate with us and influence our world? I'll share the stories. You decide for yourself. I'm your host, Will. Welcome to the Red Treehouse. True Ghost Stories, written by Herwood Carrington. What is a ghost? Ghosts have been believed in by every nation, at every time, and at every stage of the world's evolution. No matter where we may go, we find them stalking through the pages of history, and even in our own cynical and materialistic age, we not only find them still, but the evidence for their existence is stronger than ever. It is nonsense to say that no sensible person believes in ghosts, because many thousands of them do. Why do they believe? Would they believe if they had no cause to do so? The terror of the dark, which we all have more or less, from which every child suffers, how intensely, during its early years, a terror which is, to a certain extent, shared by animals and even insects, does all this signify nothing? Those who have looked into this question thoroughly believe that there is, in every truth, a terrible reality justifying this instinctive fear. That evil and horrible things lurk about us in the still, weird hours of the night. That there are truly powers and principalities with which we often toy, without knowing or realizing the frightful dangers which result from this tampering with the unseen world. Yes, there is a true tyranny of the dark. Phenomena and ghostly manifestations take place in darkness, which would never occur in light, and which cease when a light is struck. All ghostly phenomena are associated with darkness and the wee small hours of the night. All this is exemplified in the following interesting narrative, which I may entitle The Terror of the Dark. All my life I have been afraid of the dark, said an acquaintance the other day when we were discussing psychical matters. I know that it is childish, he continued, and I ought to have outgrown it years ago. But as a matter of fact, I haven't. After all, isn't there some reason for the fears that we all feel, more or less, at that time? Doesn't the Bible speak of the terrors of the dark? And are not all animals, and even insects, afraid of the dark? So much so that you cannot induce them to enter a dark place if they can help it. Light not only enables you to see what is around you, but it acts in a certain positive manner over the powers of darkness, whatever they are, and prevents their operation. All spirit mediums will tell you that materialization and manifestations of that character cannot take place in the light. It prevents their occurrence. So after all, as I said, isn't there some reasonable ground for one's fear at such times? I said nothing, but gazed into the fire. After all, were not his arguments somewhat impressive? But, continued my friend, it is not altogether because of these speculative reasons that I fear the dark. It is because of a terrible experience I once had, and which has left me terror-struck ever since, whenever I am left without light even for an instant. I will tell you the story, and let you judge for yourself. It was several years ago, in an old house we rented at that time, and from which we removed soon after the event I am about to relate. I was afraid of the dark, even then, and always left a nightlight burning by the side of my bed when I went to sleep. One night I woke up, feeling the springs of the bed on which I was lying vibrate in a peculiar manner, impossible to describe. Looking up, I saw, standing by the side of my bed, a young man dressed in rags, having a face ghastly white, and showing every indication of dissipation. He was regarding me intently. I shall never forget the shock I received on beholding that figure, not only because of the unexpected appearance, but because of the fact that I could perceive the opposite wall and furniture through the body. I knew at once that I beheld a spirit, and my blood ran cold at the thought. What I had dreaded all my life was at last fulfilled. My next thought was, I am so glad the nightlight is burning. What should I do if I were in darkness? As though the form read my thoughts and was intent on torturing me to the limit of endurance, it leaned over, and the next instant had snuffed the candle. The phantom and I were alone in the black darkness. Words cannot describe my feeling at that instant. The blood froze in my veins, and the tongue clave to the roof of my mouth. I tried to speak, but could not. I only held out one hand as if to ward off the awful presence by pressing it away. The next instant I felt the bedclothes gently turned down on the farther side of the bed, and partly pulled off me. The springs of the bed were depressed, and I knew that the fearsome visitor was crawling into bed. It would lie down by my side, perhaps touch me, perhaps, who could tell? The agony of mind I experienced in those few moments I shall never forget. My only wonder is that my reason did not give way. Then, a curious thing happened. Even in the state of mind, as I was then, I could perceive that the bed was gradually rising up again into its normal position. The weight upon it was growing less and less. Finally, it was again level, and I felt the bedclothes carefully replaced over me. The phantom had withdrawn. For hours I lay awake, not daring to move. After what seemed a century, the first faint shafts of light fell across the room, betokening the welcome morn. Finally, glorious day broke. Glorious light. Hateful darkness. Cannot you see why I hate it so? But unfortunately, this evil and horrible side of Ghostland is not universal. Ghosts do not always present themselves as so formidable and gruesome. Some of them prove helpful. Others seem to wish to right a wrong. Some even seem to have a sense of humor. So there are all sorts of ghosts. just as there are all sorts of people. And the variety is just as great in the one case as in the other. But after all, what is a ghost? What do we mean by this? Where do ghosts live, and how? What do they do with themselves? How do they manifest? Why do they return? These are some of the questions which the average man asks himself, unless he totally disbelieves in them. Most men, it is true, disbelieve in ghosts, unless they have had some experience to convince them to the contrary. Yet after all, why should they? As Mr. W.T. Stead once remarked, real ghost stories. How can there be real ghost stories when there are no real ghosts? But are there no real ghosts? You may not have seen one, but it does not follow that therefore they do not exist. How many of us have seen the microbe that kills? There are at least as many persons who testify that they have seen apparitions as there are men of science who have examined the microbe. You and I, who have seen neither, must perforce take the testimony of others. The evidence for the microbe may be conclusive. The evidence as to apparitions may be worthless. But in both cases, it is a case of testimony, not of personal experience. The average conception of a ghost is probably somewhat as follows: that it is a thin, tall figure, wrapped in a sheet, walking about the house, clanking chains behind it, and scaring out of his wits anyone who sees it. According to this view, a ghost would be as material and substantial a thing as a buzzsaw or a lapdog, and exists just as fully in space. Such, however, is not the conception of the ghost which modern science entertains. Many investigators who have examined this question closely have come to the conclusion that ghosts do actually exist. But when we come to the more troublesome question, what are they? We are met at once with difficulties and disagreements. The recent scientific theories and explanations of the subject are complex and subtle, and necessitate a certain preliminary knowledge on the part of the student in order for him to fully understand them. The first case we take is from M. Flammarion's book, The Unknown, page 108, and is as follows. My mother, who lived in Burgundy, heard one Tuesday, between 9 and 10 o'clock, the door of the bedroom open and close violently. At the same time, she heard herself called twice, Lucy, Lucy. The following Tuesday, she heard that her Uncle Clementin, who had always had a great affection for her, had died that Tuesday morning, precisely between 9 and 10 o'clock. In the following instance, the notification is in visual instead of auditory form, and is taken from the proceedings, pages 213 and 214. About the 14th of September 1882, my sister and I felt worried and distressed by hearing the death watch. It lasted a whole day and night. We got up earlier than usual the next morning, about 6 o'clock, to finish some birthday presents for our mother. As my sister and I were working and talking together, I looked up and saw our young acquaintance standing in front of me and looking at us. I turned to my sister. She saw nothing. I looked again to where he stood. He had vanished. We agreed not to tell anyone. Some time afterwards, we heard that our young acquaintance had either committed suicide or had been killed. He was found dead in the woods 24 hours after landing. On looking back to my diary, I found that the marks I made in it corresponded to the date of his death. The following case is reported in Podmore's Apparitions and Thought Transference, page 265. The first Thursday of April 1881, while sitting at tea with my back to the window and talking with my wife in the usual way, I plainly heard a rap at the window, and looking round, I said to my wife, "Why, there's my grandmother," and went to the door, but could not see anyone. And still feeling sure it was my grandmother, and knowing that though 83 years of age, she was very active and fond of a joke, I went round the house, but still could not see anyone. My wife did not hear it. On the following Saturday, I had news that my grandmother died in Yorkshire about half an hour before the time I heard the rapping. The last time I saw her alive, I promised, if well, I would attend her funeral. That was some 2 years before. I was in good health and had no trouble. Age, 26 years. I did not know that my grandmother was ill. Reverend Matthew Frost. Mrs. Frost writes, I beg to certify that I perfectly remember all the circumstances my husband has named, but I heard and saw nothing myself. The following case is from Phantasms of the Living, Volume 2, page 50. On February 26, 1850, I was awake, for I was to go to my sister-in-law, and visiting was then an event for me. About 2 o'clock in the morning, my brother walked into our room, my sister's, and stood beside my bed. I called to her. He was at the time quartered at Paisley, and a mail car from Belfast passed about that hour not more than a mile from our village. He looked down on us most lovingly and kindly, and waved his hand, and he was gone. I recollect it all as if it were only last night it occurred, and my feeling of astonishment, not at his coming into the room at all, but where he could have gone. At that very hour, he died. Mr. Gurney writes, we have confirmed the date of death in the Army list, and find from a newspaper notice that the death took place in the early morning, and was extremely sudden. Cases such as the above could be multiplied into the hundreds, but it is not necessary. For our present purposes, the above samples will at least serve to show the character of these death coincidences, and how accurate and how numerous they often are. We'll continue right after this quick ad break. Ghosts which move material objects. Such is the theory, rather far-fetched, it is true, but certainly the most rational and common sense so far advanced to explain many of the facts. It is probable, however, that this explanation will not serve to explain all of them. Thus, in those cases where the apparition moved a material object, opened a door, etc., such a theory would have to be abandoned, for the simple reason that a mental concept, an hallucination, cannot open doors and move objects. There must be an outstanding, material entity to effect this. There must be a real ghost. And in those cases where the apparition has been seen by several persons at once, or even photographed, it seems more reasonable to suppose that a material, space-occupying body was present rather than to assume that the various witnesses or the camera were hallucinated. In the following cases, for example, the apparition performs a definite physical action, snuffs a candle with its fingers, an action which a pure hallucination could hardly be supposed to perform. The account is by the Reverend D.W.G. Gwynn, and is printed in Phantasms of the Living, Volume 2, pages 202 to 203. After telling of certain minor phenomena, he proceeds, I now come to the mutual experience of something that is as fresh in its impression as if it were the occurrence of yesterday. During the night, I became aware of a draped figure passing across the foot of the bed towards the fireplace. I had the impression that the arm was raised, pointing with the hand towards the mantelpiece, on which a nightlight was burning. Mrs. Gwynn at this moment seized my arm, and the light was extinguished. Notwithstanding, I distinctly saw the figure returning towards the door, and being under the impression that one of our servants had found her way into the room, I leaped out of bed to intercept the intruder, but found and saw nothing. Mrs. Gwynn confirms the story, adding, I distinctly saw the hand of the phantom placed over the nightlight, which was at once extinguished. Theories of haunted houses. If we grant that certain houses may be haunted, in the sense that they may be the centers of influences and forces as yet unseen and unknown, the question is, how explain such cases? What hypotheses can we advance to explain cases of haunted houses, which will recognize the reality of the phantom witness therein, and attempt to explain them as rationally as possible? 4 main theories have been advanced by way of explanation, which I shall briefly outline. 1. There is the theory that the figures seen in houses of this nature are genuine outstanding entities, real beings, which are just as real, though less solid and tangible, as any of the living inhabitants of the house. This is, of course, the popular conception of the ghosts seen in haunted houses, and it must be admitted that such a theory covers and explains the facts more completely and fully than any other. There are also many facts telling in its favor. For instance, when 2 persons see a figure from different angles or viewpoints, and one describes it in profile, while the other describes it as presenting a full face likeness. And if this is the angle in each case from which a real figure would naturally be seen, this surely seems to indicate that a solid form of some sort was present. Again, when 3 or 4 or more people see a figure at the same time, it is surely a strain upon our credulity to believe that a number of persons were similarly hallucinated at precisely the same time and in the same manner, and easier to believe that they all saw a figure at the same time, though in differing degrees of vividness and detail. Thirdly, we have the evidence from photography. In some instances, these figures have been photographed, and though there is doubtless much fraud in this connection, there is evidence that, in certain cases, genuine photographs of this nature have been taken. This is discussed elsewhere in this volume, however. Fourthly, we have the behavior of animals in haunted houses. They often appear to see figures visible or invisible to others present at the time, bark at them, rub against them, stare at them, act as though terrified at what they see, etc. This will be noticed in many of the stories, and can be explained only with difficulty if we are to believe that the figures seen are merely hallucinations. One question of considerable interest remains. It is this: can so-called haunted houses be cured? Many of those who live in houses of this character would like to have these influences removed, but are unable to rid themselves of them. Can this be done? In some cases, this has doubtless been accomplished, while in others it has failed. We know too little as yet to lay down any arbitrary laws or rules which may be followed with safety in cases of this character. Sometimes one method succeeds, while another fails. I have known of cases where exorcism worked a complete cure, of others in which it failed miserably. I have known cases in which suggestion, rightly applied, rid the house of its ghost. In other instances, no result was produced by similar methods. In a few instances, mediums and psychics have been able to assist. In others, their presence only seemed to make matters worse. We can but experiment and learn. Those who may be more interested in this aspect of the question will find it treated in Chapter 15 of my book, The Coming Science, which is devoted to haunted houses and their cure. How ghosts influence us. The following is a very interesting case, which brings vividly before us the fact that ghosts often draw power from those who witness their manifestations, just as they draw vitality from a materializing medium during a seance. As cases of this character are rare, the following is of considerable value. It was an afternoon, last autumn, about 6 o'clock. I had returned from a stroll and was sitting in my own apartment on Central Park West, reading Vanity Fair. While turning over its pages, I became suddenly aware of a novel and indescribable sensation. My chest and breathing became inwardly oppressed by some ponderous weight, while I became conscious of some presence behind me, exerting a powerful influence on the forces within. On trying to turn my head to see what it could be, I was powerless to do so. Neither could I lift a hand or move in any way. I was not a little alarmed and began immediately to reason. My mind was alive, though physically I was unable to move a muscle. It was as if the current of nerve force within seemed forcibly drawn together and focused on a spot in front of me. I gazed motionless, as though with something intenser than ordinary eyesight, on what was no longer vacant space. There, an oval misty light was forming, elongatory, widening, yes, actually developing into a human face and form. Was this hallucination, or some vision of the unseen, coming in so unexpected a fashion? Before me had arisen a remarkable figure, never seen before in a picture or life. Dark-skinned, aged, with white beard, the expression intensely earnest, the features small, the bald head finely molded, lofty over the forehead, the whole demeanor instinct with solemn grace. He was speaking to me in deep tones, as if with urgency. What would I not give to hear words from such a figure? But no effort availed me to distinguish one articulate sound. I tried to speak, but could not. With desperate effort, I shook out the words, "Speak louder." The face grew more intent, the voice louder and more empathetic. Was there something amiss with my own hearing then, that I could distinguish no word amid these deeply emphasized tones? Slowly and deliberately the figure vanished, through the same stages of indistinctness, back to the globular lamp-like whiteness till it faded to nothingness. Before it had quite faded away, the face only of a woman arose, indistinct and dim. The same emphatic hum, though in a subdued note, the same paralysis of voice and muscle, the same strange force, as it was overshadowing me. With the disappearance of the second and far less interesting figure, I recovered my power of movement and arose. My first impulse was to look around for the origin of this strange force. My second, to rush to the looking glass to make sure of myself. There could be no illusion. There I was, paler than usual, the forehead bathed in perspiration. I threw open the window. It was no dream. There were the passing trolley cars below, clanging up and down, while a crowd of noisy youngsters were playing in the park across the way. I sponged my face, and greatly agitated, walked hurriedly to and fro. If this is real, I thought, it may recur. I would sit in the same position, try to be calm, read a book, remain as still and passive as I could, and see the result. To my intense interest, and almost at once, the strange sense of some power operating on the nerve forces within, followed by the same force of muscular power, the same wide awakeness of the reason, the same drawing out and concentrating of the energies on that spot in front, repeated itself, this time more deliberately, leaving me freer to take mental notes of what was happening. Again arose the noble, earnest figure, gazing at me, the hands moving in solemn accompaniment to the deep tones of voice. The same effort, painful on my part, to hear with no result. The vision passed. Again the woman's face, insignificant and meaningless, succeeded it as before. She spoke, but in less emphatic tones. It flashed upon me that I would hear. After a frantic effort, I caught two words: land, America, with positively no clue to their meaning. I was wide awake when the first apparition appeared, and in a highly excited state of mind on its reappearance. We'll continue right after this quick ad break. The apparition of the murdered boy. At the commencement of the French Revolution, Lady Penniman and her two daughters and her friend, Mrs. Atkins, retired to Lyle, where they had hired a large and handsome house. A few weeks after taking possession, the housekeeper, with many apologies for being obliged to mention anything that might appear so idle and absurd, came to the apartment in which her mistress was sitting and said that 2 of the servants who had accompanied her ladyship from England had that morning given warning and expressed a determination of quitting her ladyship's service on account of the mysterious noises by which they had been night after night disturbed and terrified. The room from which the sounds were supposed to have proceeded was at a distance from Lady Penniman's apartments, and immediately over those that were occupied by the servants. To quiet the alarm, Lady Penniman resolved on leaving her own chamber for a time, and establishing herself in the one which had been lately occupied by the domestics. The room above was a long, spacious one, which appeared to have been for a long time deserted. In the center of the chamber was a large iron cage. It was said that the late proprietor of the house, a young man of enormous wealth, had in his minority been confined in this cage by his uncle and guardian, and starved to death. On the first night or 2 of Lady Penniman's being established in her new apartment, she met with no interruption. This quiet, however, was of very short duration. One night she was awakened from her sleep by a slow and heavy step pacing the chamber overhead. It continued to move backwards and forwards for nearly an hour. There were more complaints from the housekeeper. No servants would remain. Lady Penniman began herself to be alarmed. She requested the advice of Mrs. Atkins, a woman devoid of every kind of superstitious fear and of tried courage. Mrs. Atkins determined to make the cage room itself her sleeping quarters. A bed was accordingly placed in the apartment, and Mrs. Atkins retired to rest, attended by her favorite spaniel, saying, as she bade them all good night, "I and my dog are able to compete with a myriad of ghosts." Mrs. Atkins examined the chamber in every imaginable direction. She sounded every panel of the wainscot to prove that there was no hollowness that might argue a concealed passage, and having securely bolted the door of the room, retired to rest, confident that she was secure against every material visitor, and totally incredulous of the airy encroachments of spiritual beings. She had only been asleep a few minutes when her dog, which lay by her bedside, leaped, howling and terrified, on the bed. The bolted door of the chamber slowly opened, and a pale, thin, sickly youth came in, cast his eyes mildly toward her, walked up to the iron cage in the middle of the room, and then leaned in the melancholy attitude of one revolving in his mind the sorrows of a cheerless and unblessed existence. After a while, he again withdrew, and retired by the way he entered. Mrs. Atkins, on witnessing his departure, felt the return of her resolution. She persuaded herself to believe the figure the work of some skillful impostor, and she determined on following its footsteps. To her infinite surprise, she discovered it to be fastened, as she had herself left it on retiring to bed. On withdrawing the bolt and opening the door, she saw the back of the youth descending the staircase. She followed till, on reaching the foot of the stairs, the form seemed to sink into the earth. The event was related to Lady Penniman. She determined to remain no longer in her present habitation. Another residence was offered in the vicinity of Lyle, and this she took under the pretext that it was better suited to the size of her family. I'll admit, to me these stories are fascinating, because they prove, at least in some sense, that we've always been interested and intrigued by the supernatural. There's just so much stuff that feels impossible to explain, and that the rational mind simply can't make sense of. I'll read more excerpts in the coming weeks. As we close this episode of the Red Treehouse, we're left with these lingering questions. Are ghosts real? And if so, can they communicate with us and influence our world? I've shared the stories. Now you decide for yourself. I'm your host, Will. Thanks for joining me in the Red Treehouse.